All right, hello everyone. So today we're going to be lecturing on chapter 13, which is the peripheral nervous system. So last chapter we talked about the central nervous system, which is just the brain and the spinal cord. Now we exit the brain and spinal cord and look at all the nerves in the body. Not only all the nerves in the body, we look at all the cranial nerves and what a nerve looks like. So here, looking at the peripheral nervous system, we see this abbreviated as the PNS. So it gathers input from sensory receptors and sends motor output to the effector. So we don't only go out, we also need to bring sensory input in. So we have to look at these sensory receptors and sensation, how that works. So when you touch a hot pan, you have a thermoreceptor in your hand that can sense that heat increase, sends a signal to your spinal cord, to then release your hand, and then it also sends a signal up to your brain that says, hey, I touched something hot. We'll be looking at some of these sensory receptors, and the main ones we're going to be discussing is a lot of these come up throughout A and P2. And then we'll look at how the sensory information is processed, and then we'll look at some of these transmission lines, what the structure of a nerve is. So we have a nerve, and it looks like a rope, but what does the internal structure look like? What are the different layers of connective tissue we have that hold that nerve together? So we'll look at the nerves and the associated ganglia. Remember, a cluster of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system is called a ganglia. Within the central nervous system is called a nuclei. Then we'll have two sections here. One will be looking at cranial nerves. The other one we're looking at spinal nerves. We'll take a break after cranial nerves here. And then part 3 then looks at motor endings. How do we monitor stretch, muscles, joints, and things like that via a peripheral nervous system? Then that all then relates to reflex activity. So you step on glass, you jump off, one leg retracts, the other extends. So we're going to look at those reflex arcs and these spinal reflexes that occur when you're doing something like walking or driving, where something feels autonomic, even though it's not really autonomic, but it still kind of is. So if you remember, we talked about central nervous system last chapter. Now we're going to be talking about peripheral nervous system and looking at the sensory division and motor division. And then also today, it's the somatic nervous system. This is what's controlling your skeletal muscle. Next chapter, we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, which is the one that happens automatically. So that's next chapter. And that's broken down to the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So first thing here, we're going to be going into these sensory receptors. So these respond by some sort of stimuli. And like we talked about in the chapter 11 on the general features of the nervous system and the neurons, we have to have a potential. This is all done via electrical charge. So these receptors have ways to cause greater potentials that lead to the action potential in those neurons. So there has to be an awareness of the stimulus or its sensation, such as touching that hot pan, and then interpretation of it, which is perception, which occurs in the brain. So you touch a hot pan, your hand is only like, oh, that was hot, and you move your hand away. But then your brain is like, oh, that was a hot pan. You then perceive what that sensation was. So, but by that point, your hand is already away from the pan. So 3 ways to classify receptors. One is by type of stimulus. So is it pressure? Is it chemical? Is it temperature? And so forth. Where it is it inside the body or more on the external side? And then also structural complexity, meaning is it encased in connective tissue or is it more like a free nerve ending? So now by stimulus type, these ones are all important here, and the name tells you what they are. So a mechanoreceptor, these are mechanical, meaning they have to be moved. They respond to touch, pressure, vibration, and stretch. Thermo, I mentioned these already in the intro parts here. So thermoreceptors are changes in temperature. Photo, these ones are for vision. So photoreceptors respond to light energy. So the wavelength of light actually hits these photoreceptors in the eye, and that's how you're seeing this video right now. Chemoreceptors, chemochemical. So chemoreceptors respond to chemicals. So smell, taste, changes in blood chemistry, etc. These ones are very important in the blood for respiratory rates and so forth. Remember, if CO2 levels increase in the blood, it activates the autonomic response to increase breathing rate, depth, and heart rate. And then the one that doesn't really tell you what it means from the word are nociceptors. These ones, pain. So whenever you're feeling pain, it's because these nociceptors are firing. So extreme heat or cold, excessive pressure, or inflammatory chemicals are usually activating these nociceptors. And then by location. So like I said, they could be more external. They're called exteroceptors. If they're internal, they're called interoceptors. So exteroceptors respond to stimuli arising outside the body. So touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and these are mostly special sense organs as well. There's a chapter 15 coming up. It's all about the special senses. So we're going to be talking about a lot of these exteroceptors then. Then interoreceptors, stimuli arising from the internal viscera and blood vessels. So internal, intero. So chemical changes, tissue stretch, temperature changes, etc. Sometimes you can cause discomfort, but usually the person's unaware of their workings. And then the last type here are proprioceptors. These are kind of like intero, but they're responding to stretch in the skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, and connective tissue. So proprio, think stretch. They're monitoring the stretch, making sure you don't tear a ligament, a muscle, and so forth. So they restrict one's movement if there's too much stretch in that region. And then here, next type here is receptor structure. So what does it look like? First ones here are simple receptors of the general senses. These are just modified free endings found throughout the body, and this is for most types. Receptors for special senses, though, so vision, hearing, equilibrium, smell, and taste. We'll talk about these later. There's housed in these complex sense organs. They get it. Their complexity gets their own chapter coming up. So just highlighting them now, but we will talk about them in more detail later. And then there are then the simple receptors for the general senses. So touch, pressure, stretch, vibration, temperature, pain, muscle sense. So there's no one receptor, one function. Receptors can respond to multiple stimuli. So it's whatever can cause an action potential is what matters. And they can be non-encapsulated, which means they have a free nerve ending, or they can be encapsulated. So if this was my receptor right here, this would have a massive amount of encapsulation around it, protecting it. So sometimes these are pressure receptors. So if you get a pressure pushing down, pushing on that encapsulation, that pressure would then push on the sensor inside there. So here, looking at them a little bit more, and then I'll show some examples. So non-encapsulated are free nerve endings. Some examples of these ones are the inner skin. So tactile or Merkel dysfunctions, light touch receptors located in deeper layers of the epidermis, and then your hair follicle receptors. So if you remember the structure of a hair follicle, around the base of the hair follicle, you have these free nerve endings. So light touch receptors, so you can feel like a mosquito landing on your arm. And then here, that's looking at some tables for some of these look like. So structural class here, non-encapsulated. This is what the free nerve endings look like here. And then here is by location and stimulus type, and then where you can find them in the body. So just for how to read these tables in your textbook. Then more non-encapsulated ones. So these ones are modified free nerve ending. So this is a free nerve ending, but it has another cell that helps make it work. So these, again, are the little pressure receptors. Then here's the hair follicle one as well. And then we look at the encapsulated. So here you can see these layers of connective tissue surrounding these encapsulated fibers. So here, tactile or Meissner's corpuscles. So we find these in different regions of the epidermis as well. So papilla, hair of the skin, genitalia, nipples, fingertips, soles of feet, and eyelids. And then these Pacinian corpuscles, these are for deeper pressure, and there you can see that encapsulation around a nerve fiber in the middle. And then more encapsulated ones, we have these bulbous corpuscles or Ruffini endings. I'm not going to expect you to remember every single one of these. I'm just showing there's a bunch of different ones that exist. Muscle spindles, we'll talk about these later. These are spindle fibers here are monitoring stretch of muscle fibers. And they work with these tendon organs, which are nerve endings that are monitoring the stretch of your tendons. And then there are also some joint kinesthetic receptors as well, monitoring joint movement and whatnot. So all these receptors work together, and their ultimate purpose is survival. So we have to have sensation. We have to be aware of changes in the environment. Imagine you walked out into the frigid temperature and you didn't realize it was frigid. And you didn't even, you weren't able to alter your body to regulate yourself and initiate shivering. You wouldn't survive. And then perception is how you perceive those stimuli. So it all works together for this sensory perception. So general organization then is this is all the somatosensory system. So there's a somatosensory cortex in your brain, remember? So that's where it all gets analyzed. So it receives inputs from the exteroceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors, then relayed toward the head, but it's processed along the way. So it's constantly analyzed as it goes through. So this is a reflex arc. It goes right back out and has an effect. If it's not, it goes along the whole pathway. So this is kind of just a reminder of what we talked about last chapter in these different receptor level and circuit level processing. So we're getting these sensations coming up through the spinal cord. They can go to the cerebellum where they're getting processed. They can then go through the thalamus, which is the major organizing center, going up to the somatosensory cortex. And then if there's an output that's needed, it then goes out the motor cortex. So then the motor cortex then goes out, it gets feedback, and then it then works its way back out to the particular motor fiber. So there's a receptor level, which is where we receive the input, a circuit level, which is the processing along the way, and then the final level up here is that perceptual level where you're actually analyzing that sensory input. So processing at the receptor level is kind of what we just talked about. So you have to generate that signal and make an action potential is what it comes down to. And then there is an adaptation event. This is unique. So changes in sensitivity in the presence of constant stimulus. Think about if you live in or not really live in, or you're in a smelly area. Say something smells around you. Eventually that smell goes away. It's not until you leave, let's say you just cooked something really stinky in your house, or your coworker microwaved fish in their microwave. So if you were in the break room while your coworker was microwaving fish, you'd smell it then, but then that fish smell will go away. Now, let's say you leave for an hour, you go working, then you're like, okay, I need to go grab a water. You go back to the break room, and then you get hit with that fish smell all over again. And then you realize how bad it smells. So this is what happens in your senses. Your body isn't constantly firing that smell for fish. And this is why, if you happen to be somewhere that's stinky, you might not realize it's stinky until you leave and come back, and then you have to search your house for where that stink is coming from. So here, membranes can become less responsive, and they decline in frequency or stop. And smell is a big one that does this adaptation. So basic receptors are fast adapting ones in signals at the beginning or end of stimulus, so pressure, touch, and smell. Tonic receptors adapt slowly or not at all, so nociceptors and most proprioceptors are like that. And then you go up the processing at the circuit level. It's just they can go different places. There's first order sensory neurons, second order sensory neurons, and third order ones. It just all depends on where they go to. Not going to dwell on those topics too much. And then at the perceptual level, how is that information perceived? And this is where it gets complex because it can bring in information from other parts of the brain as well. So if you're touching a hot pan, you can also be looking at that hot pan. So multiple stimuli can be coming in for one perception. So ability to detect the stimulus requires a summation of impulses for that perceptual detection and the magnitude estimation. So how hot is that pan? And then spatial discrimination. So this is identifying a site or pattern of stimulus, so where it is in space, and then feature abstraction, more complex abstract. So if you step on Legos when walking through your house at night, it's dark out, but when you step on it, you jump off right away, and then you realize you stepped on Legos afterwards. So that's feature abstraction. Quality discrimination, so sweet or sour taste. So if you were eating something blind, you would then figure out and discriminate the different qualities as you're eating from your taste reception. And pattern recognition here, recognizing pieces in music, faces, and so forth. Now, one interesting thing I want to talk about here is pain tolerance. So everyone gets the same amount of action potentials when it comes to the same pain amount initiated. So say everyone stepped on the Legos, everyone was the same mass, and everyone stepped on the Legos and had the same amount of action potentials fired to the brain. Some people could walk across those Legos, I guess, I don't know if anyone can do that. But some people can tolerate pain more than others. So what is sensitivity to pain or pain tolerance? So everyone fires the same amount of action potentials. Everything reaches the brain. It all depends on how the brain perceives that pain. That's the differences we have among us when it comes to pain tolerance. So research and use of genetics determine best pain treatment is ongoing, and genetics comes down to a lot of this pain tolerance. And then if you ever go to the doctor, sometimes they're like, where do you feel the pain? That's actually a really important question because of this visceral and referred pain. So visceral pain results from stimulation of visceral organ receptors. So it could help tell them which organ might be affected. And referred pain then is pain from one body region perceived as coming from a different region. So look at the heart here. Pain in the heart can be felt in the neck and all the way down the left arm. That's why if you feel left arm pain, it's a sign that maybe there's um, heart attack coming soon or something wrong with the heart. So where you gallbladder is interesting. Look, you can actually perceive pain in the right shoulder along with where the gallbladder is. Very interesting how that perceived pain works. But that's why they always ask, where do you feel the pain? And then some other interesting things here. So long-lasting or tense pain, such as limb amputation, can lead to something called hyperalgesia, which is pain amplification, chronic pain, or phantom limb pain. So phantom limb pain is pain felt in a limb that has been amputated. So after the amputation, there's so much severe trauma that you can still perceive pain in a leg that's no longer there. So now epidural anesthesia during surgery to reduce that phantom pain. And then here is other management methods to help the spinal cord learn that hyperalgesia. So it's all about pain management for these cases. Now, I want to go into the structure of a nerve. So a nerve, don't mix up some terminology here. So you have nerve, and then you have a neuron, and then you have a nerve fiber. So a fiber is a single neuron. A nerve is a bunch of neurons or a bunch of axons. So it's a cord-like organ. So it's a bundle of myelinated and non-myelinated axons enclosed by connective tissue. So it's tons, thousands upon thousands. So there are spinal nerves and cranial nerves. We're going to break each down. But look, first we want to look at the structure of the nerve. We have a layer of connective tissue on the outside that's upon the nerve. That's called the epineurum. So epineurum around the outside. Here it's labeled down here on this one of this SEM image. And so around all fascicles. And we mentioned the same things when we talked about the muscles. The next one is the perineurium. So coarse connective tissue that bundles fibers into fascicles. So same as muscles. Right here is the perineurium. So there are these little bundles of axons in here. And there's this connective tissue that kind of holds them together in these little cord-like structures here. That connective tissue is the perineurium. And then around individual axons here, there's also connective tissue that's called the endoneurium. So it encloses axons and their myelin sheath, Schwann cells. So you have the endoneurium around one axon, and you have a group of axons that's surrounded by another layer of connective tissue. It's called the perineurium. And then you have the epineurum that holds it all together again, and that makes one nerve. And now, just as a note, there's fibers running that way and fibers running that way. There's sensory fibers coming towards the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system is sending motor outputs out. So it's a two-way highway for these neurons. So these are called mixed nerves. They contain both sensory and motor fibers, so going to and from the central nervous system. So there's the sensory or afferent division, or sensory nerves. Some only do go toward the central nervous system, and if they go away from the central nervous system, they're motor nerves. We'll see these when talking about some of the cranial nerves. Some only do sensory, some only do motor, some do both. So pure sensory or pure motor are rare. So that's why I said mostly we'll see these in the central nervous system. So type of fibers in mixed nerves, so they're just referred to by what they do. So somatic afferent, going sensory from muscle to brain. Somatic efferent, motor from brain to muscle. And then same thing for visceral, afferent and efferent. It's just whether it's going to brain or from brain out. And like I said, the ganglia are a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Nuclei are a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. We've come across this word already. The dorsal root ganglia, right here, is a cluster of cell bodies for the sensory input division into the central nervous system. And we're going to come across a bunch of autonomic ganglia next chapter when talking about the autonomic nervous system. There's this thing that lines your pretty much the thoracic region of your back where you have what's called a sympathetic trunk, which is a chain of ganglia on each side of your spinal cord. Very, very important part of your sympathetic nervous system, but that's all next chapter. One other unique thing about the peripheral nervous system is that there's some slight regenerative capability. Unlike the central nervous system cannot regenerate, but peripheral can. So axon may regenerate in peripheral nervous system, does not occur in central nervous system. So how does this work and why does it work? This is because of Schwann cells. Schwann cells are the reason this happens. So they can, the comparison to the central nervous system where you have the oligodendrocytes reach out and wrap around multiple axons. Schwann cells are confined to that little region. So if you have a break in that little region, they can actually reach out and hold that region together. So here, let's say this axon fragmented here. And so the ends seal themselves off where that fragment happens. And then what happens is, so degeneration of the distal end of the cut axon then occurs. So this distal end starts breaking down. This is called a unique term, Wallerian degeneration. It then spreads down the axon. So then we have to remove these fragments as we move forward now. So step 2 then, these Schwann cells and macrophages now play the key roles. So they're cleaning out the dead axon distal to the injury, and then they're going to start regrowing this. So they make these little filaments or these axon sprouts. Really, really neat how this works. So this then grows out. These axon filaments grow through a regeneration tube that's kind of held together by these Schwann cells overlapping. So this is what's unique about these Schwann cells. They line up the tube of the remaining endoneurium, forming a regeneration tube that guides the regenerating axon sprouts across the gap to the original contact. So over here, you still have the remaining axon. So these are finding that axon and growing out and getting them. Then the last step here, the new axon regenerates, and then you remyelinate that region. So it's really cool that you can have some regenerative capability of the peripheral nervous system, and it's due to the Schwann cells, whereas central nervous system, you only have oligodendrocytes. Okay, I want to go through part B first before taking a little break here. So part B is on the cranial nerves. So at the base of the brain, or coming out of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, we have the first exits of the peripheral nervous system. These are called cranial nerves, and we have 12 pairs. So 2 are attached to forebrain, rest are with the brainstem. Most are mixed nerves, but 2 pairs are purely sensory, and we'll go over this, and I have a laboratory video that discusses this as well. And so we number them with Roman numerals, and you have an empty table in your workbook that you should fill out with these 2. Try to fill them out without looking at the table, though, because you want to be able to have these down and name them. We'll be coming back to them a lot throughout the next couple of chapters here. Now, there are some ways to remember the orders. You can couple different mnemonics the book mentions. So on occasion, our trusty truck acts funny. Very good vehicle anyhow. I don't really like that one. I use this one. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So what do all these words stand for? Olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. And so when you're reading these tables, so that's 12, and don't worry, you'll be able to say them all eventually too. Sensory function is this part of the table. So like olfactory is for smell. Optic is for vision. Oculomotor, it's only for motor function for working muscles around the eye. And here, PS stands for parasympathetic, highlighted down here. And so that's part of a parasympathetic response. Oculomotor has a parasympathetic response, and that makes sense. So if someone shines a flashlight in your eye, your lens changes shape and changes the amount of light coming through. So that's a parasympathetic response. So yes, little examples like that. So going through, I'm not going to go them all here. We're just going to go through them all one by one. This is just showing where they are on the brain. I have pretty much the exact same thing that I did in the lab video. So I'm not going to go over them all here, but they are labeled based going from the anterior side to the posterior side. So starting with olfactory, optic, oculomotor, and then over here is then trochlear, and then coming back, trigeminal, and then over here, abducens, and working back around to the outside, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. And make sure you watch that lab video where I actually show where these are on the brain model, and it helps show it much better than this image does. But here we're going to focus on what each nerve does and what it does, where it goes. So I don't really focus on that as much in the video. Olfactory nerves, these are for smell. So that's all you really need to know from that. If you remember the skeletal system, there's that cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone with all those little holes in it. And then right above that, we have the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract that begins the olfactory nerve. So these are purely sensory as well, only perceiving smell. And then optic nerve, this is for vision. So these will come back up in the next chapter. They come back and actually crisscross in the middle of the brain here in the sella turcica of the sphenoid, and that's called the optic chiasma. It's a little crisscross region. But this is the optic nerve, also purely sensory for visual function. Oculomotor, like the one I just mentioned, these ones are going to the muscles of the eye, which we'll talk about these eye muscles coming up in the eye chapter. So function in raising eyelid, directing eyeball, constricting the iris. So this is that parasympathetic thing I mentioned, and also controlling lens shape. And then your trochlear nerves, this is called the trochlea, and this is the superior oblique muscle in the eye. The trochlear nerve innervates or goes to that muscle. So that's why it's called that. So this comes through the orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure in the back of the eye. So primary motor nerve that directs eyeball. So we have like 4 different nerves that go to eye muscles. Next one is the trigeminal, So there are 3 divisions. There's the ophthalmic, which is V1. So here, if you're looking at this, ophthalmic is also going to the eye. So it goes through that fissure as well, and then goes up and out of the eye. So it uses the eye as a route to get there. Maxillary is then V2, going to the regions of the maxilla. Mandibular is then going to the mandible. So these sensory impulses from V1 and V2, and motor fibers for mastication to V3. Abducens just goes to the eye, to the lateral rectus muscle. So it's primarily a motor nerve innervating the lateral rectus muscle of the eye. Facial nerves then, this is how I like to look at the facial nerves down here. If you use your hand with the thumb downwards, that's the cervical region, there's a mandibular region, a buccal region, which is cheek, zygomatic, which is above your cheek, and then temporal up there. So 5 different divisions of the facial nerves. So motor functions include facial expression, parasympathetic impulses to lacrimal and salivary glands for initiating saliva formation and tear formation, and then sensory function for taste as well from the anterior 2/3. So a couple different ones we use for taste. The first one we use for taste is this facial nerve. These are just all the different branches we have. And when you watch the lab video, I'll show how complex this facial nerve is when showing it in the models. Well, the model being 3D organic anatomy that I have. And then vestibulocochlear nerve is a combination of nerves coming from the vestibule and the cochlea. Again, this will come back up vision. This is for balance. This is for hearing. And then it combines it. So this is for hearing and balance. So keeping your body in equilibrium and so forth. You're all sitting there watching this right now. Some of you might be laying down and watching this, but you know where your head is in position in space. That's because of this vestibulocochlear nerve and how the vestibule is working here. And you can hear me then because of your cochlea, I hope. So mostly sensory function, but there is a small component for adjustment of sensory. We'll talk about that when we get to hearing. So controlling some of the little stereocilia in your ear to prevent them from too loud of noises causing damage. There's actually a little motor output that stiffens them to prevent damage. Glossopharyngeal, so tongue, pharynx. So here, motor functions innervating part of the tongue, and pharynx for swallowing, also taste, and so forth. So, and they're also taking impulse from the carotid chemoreceptor, so monitoring the input of blood flow to the brain, making sure it's the correct pressure, not too high or not too low. So if you pass out from standing up too fast, that's because you have extremely low blood pressure and these receptors fired, and that's why your heart rate starts increasing like crazy after everything gets black. But this is then comes out the jugular foramen and then goes out to all these glands and stuff. Now, a big one, number 10 here, the vagus nerve, not vagus nerve, not VE. It's VA. So the vagus nerve is a very unique one. It's the only cranial nerve that goes beyond the head and neck region. So this is a very, very important nerve for the parasympathetic pathway because it goes to all the organs of your abdominal regions. So your rest and digest state. This is a very important one. So most motor fibers are parasympathetic fibers regulating activities of heart. So if your heart rate decreases, and when you're at rest, it's because of this. Lungs and abdominal viscera, sensory fibers, and go thoracic, baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, and taste buds. So this one also is one for taste as well. So 3 different nerves just for taste. And then number 11 here are the accessory nerves. These are monitoring the neck and the shoulder a little bit, mostly just neck, but they're coming off these cranial nerves, and they're considered, the cervical region here, but they're considered cranial nerves because they come up and they do come off the medulla oblongata just a little bit, and then they come back out. So they come up through the foramen magnum and then back out the jugular foramen. So that's why they're still considered a cranial nerve. Sometimes you might see them referred to as a spinal accessory nerve. Next up then is the hypoglossal nerve. So this is, even though it's hypoglossal, from what I remember, this one doesn't do much for taste though. This one's for swallowing and chewing. So innervate extrinsic and intrinsic muscle tongue that contribute to swallowing and speech. So allows you to speak, moves your tongue, and so forth. From what I know, this one doesn't do taste though. Does not do taste. So it's primarily motor output. So this is then comparing all the motor output and so forth. So some mixed nerves can contain both somatic and autonomic fibers. And so remember, primary functions of cranial nerves as sensory, motor, or both. There's another saying. So some say marry money. So S here is sensory, M is motor, B is both. So some say marry money, but my brother believes it's bad business to marry money. That helps you fill in these parts of the table. So if you remember those 2 mnemonics, you can get the order from one, and then you get the rest of the table from the other. And then here's the old one. Just remind you, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So then when you're referring to these nerves and looking at the models, make sure you watch that video. I made a decent summary video of that for the lab component. But right there, we'll take a break. All right, now we're going to be going into part C here, which is where we're looking at the spinal nerves. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. I might have mentioned that last chapter. So this is broken down into the cervical nerves, the thoracic nerves, the lumbar nerves, the sacral nerves, and the coccygeal nerves. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I'm just talking about the important things here of what the nerves do, because in the lab video that I made, I go over the spinal nerves, showing their locations and so forth, and talk about the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus. There's this little enlargement right here, and I use this program I have on my computer called 3D Organ and Anatomy. So make sure you watch that video as well. So here, just looking at the different structures. So a plexus is this group of nerves that come out and they crisscross and can communicate with each other. So we'll talk about the importance of that. So there are 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 little coccygeal one. The last spinal nerve, C8, exits inferior to C7, and I talk about that in the video as well. All right, now looking at the spinal nerves here. So there are 2 little roots they can have on them as they come out. They can go to the back, which is the dorsal ramus, or they can go to the front, or they have these little ventral roots. So the ventral roots are motor efferent fibers. The dorsal roots are all sensory. So, meaning the input coming in. Remember, this is kind of last chapter when we focused on that too, when we talked about the spinal cord and information coming in, the efferent and going out the afferent division. And then, so both ventral and dorsal roots are branched medially as little rootlets. So these are a bunch of little rootlets right here. So they can branch up and go through all the layers of the spinal cord. So remember last chapter we talked about that cauda equina, which is that horse's tail at the bottom. So they become progressively longer superiorly to superiorly to inferiorly down the spinal cord, where at the bottom they become the cauda equina. Spinal nerves are quite short, only 1 to 2 centimeters. And after exiting the foramen between the vertebrae, they divide into 3 branches. There's the dorsal ramus that I just mentioned, the ventral ramus, and the meningeal branch. We'll talk about all these. And then there's also something we'll refer to more next chapter when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, or the rami communicants. These are autonomic nerve fibers that join the ventral ones in the thoracic region. They usually go to the sympathetic trunk then. So those will come back up more later. So then just talking about some terminology here and where they go. The dorsal rami go to the posterior body trunk, ventral one, then going to trunk and limbs. Now, what's the difference between a roots and the rami? Roots lie medial to and form spinal nerves, and then rami lie distal to and are lateral branches, so slightly different. So all ventral rami except T2 through T12 form interlacing nerve networks called nerve plexuses. And so we're going to talk about these plexuses. There's a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, a lumbar plexus, and a sacral plexus. So this is what the brachial plexus looks like here. So C5 through T1. So these are the roots, and then they get broken down, or the rami, not the roots. Then they get broken down into the trunks, and then here they could be posterior or anterior, and then they break into cords, and then they break into the actual nerves. So this is just an example of how these plexuses crisscross and whatnot. So let me switch to the pen here. So if you had a sensory input coming up through here for the median nerve here, let's say this one was cut, it could still go up this way then and get there. So these little plexuses assist in that, allow the sensory input or motor output to go via different directions. So same thing here. So looking at the cervical plexus, most branches of this form cutaneous nerves. Whenever we see the word cutaneous, think skin. So innervating the skin or muscles near the skin. So skin of neck, ear, back of head, and shoulders. Other branches innervate neck muscles. The phrenic nerve also comes out of here. So here, what's the phrenic nerve do? Phrenic nerve goes to the diaphragm. So major muscle for breathing. That actually comes out of the cervical plexus, which is interesting to think about. So that receives nerves from C3 to C5. So all of these can branch to send information to the phrenic nerve. Oh, wait. I labeled the wrong nerve. Right here is the phrenic nerve. The C3 through C5 all can form these branches to the phrenic nerve. And then if we look at the brachial plexus here, so this is showing how we have the roots, which are the ventral rami, the trunks, there's an upper, middle, and lower trunk. So this is showing all the crazy divisions. And each one of those, each trunk has an anterior and posterior division. And then broken into the lateral, medial, and posterior core. So most of the branching is because of these divisions right here. And then they break into the musculocutaneous, the median, the ulnar, the radial, and the axillary. Again, I talk more about what each of these nerves do and where they go in the lab portion of this video. In this one, I want to talk about kind of what these nerves do. The axillary nerve is going to the deltoid, teres minor, and skin of joint and capsule of shoulder. And so typically the nerve that innervates the muscle also innervates the joint. We'll talk about that law coming up. The musculocutaneous, biceps brachii, brachialis, coracobrachialis, and skin. So muscle, skin, literally what the word means. Median nerve. So median nerve is going down right through here. So right here is the median nerve. It goes right through the carpal tunnel of the wrist. So that's the nerve that gets pushed on if you have carpal tunnel syndrome, because you have a ligament right here, and that ligament can become inflamed and push on that nerve. Ulnar nerve then comes right along the ulna right here, up through here. And if you strike your elbow, it's called striking your funny bone, which I know we've all have done. When you do that, your pinky, not your pingy, your pinky tingles. And that's because that's where the ulnar nerve goes. Radial nerve essentially innervates essentially all extensor muscle, supinaris, and posterior skin. So that comes down the radius right here, right over here. This for some reason, it disappeared. Oh, they made it green. Weird. Yeah, major nerves of the arm. So injuries to the brachial plexus are common, such as, a luxation of the shoulder or dislocation of the shoulder. Blows to the top of the shoulder can force the humerus inferiorly as bad. So it can stretch that plexus and affect all these nerves. So injury to median nerve makes it difficult to use pincer graft. So this is carpal tunnel when median nerve is compressed. So opposed thumb. So median nerve is important for the opposition movement. Then you can't pick up small objects. Ulnar nerve is also very vulnerable to injury. So this is the funny bone one I just mentioned, but also severe or chronic damage to the nerve can lead to sensory loss, paralysis, and muscle atrophy. So trouble making a fist or gripping objects. Little finger and ring fingers become hyperextended at the knuckles and flex at distal carpal interphalangeal joints. This causes hand to contort into a claw hand. And then trauma to the radial nerve results in wrist drop. There's an inability to extend the hand at the wrist. So I can't see it in the video now if you're watching this lecture live, but I'm extending my wrist. So if I don't have my radial nerve working, going down the side of my arm here, you can't do that. So this is also linked to something called Saturn night paralysis. This was in the book, so I kept it. Intoxicated person falls asleep with an arm draped over the back of the chair or sofa edge, cutting the blood supply to the nerve. So here, this radial nerve is right down through there. So if you have a lot of pressure on that nerve and you lose blood supply to the nerve, you lose supply to your arm. Or if your improper use of crutches can also do this as well. Now we move down the leg and to the lumbosacral plexus. So we talk about the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus separate. Together, you just refer to them as the lumbar sacral plexuses going to the lower half of the body. So first here, the lumbar plexus. So if we're looking at this on the model here, this is from the lumbar region. And we have all these, same thing as the brachial plexus and cervical plexus, all these nerves coming out. The one that goes through the hole in the pelvic bone here, if you remember what that hole is called, the obturator foramen, guess what nerve this is called? The obturator nerve. See how nice anatomists are sometimes. As then we come down through, all these are going on the anterior side of the hip. So that's one unique thing when we're looking at the lumbar plexus versus sacral plexus as well. So most of these are anterior. The big one here is right here. This is the femoral nerve. And anything that goes ilioinguinal, this is all going to pelvic area. Iliohypogastric, same thing. Cutaneous is going to the skin of the thigh muscles there. But the femoral one is a big one that comes down the leg here next to the femur. Now it reaches a point down here where it now becomes the saphenous nerve. And then that goes down the rest of the leg. So saphenous, this is an important word here because there's a vein that comes up through the inner thigh here. It's called your great saphenous vein. So if you remember, this is where the saphenous nerve is. When we talk about the vascular system later on, you'll be like, oh, I remember that word. And then it's easy to pinpoint where the saphenous vein is as well. So that's the lumbar plexus. And then the sacral plexus, again, we're looking at the posterior side here. So here, all these nerves are coming out, all these sacral foramens of the sacrum of the hip. And then, so a couple different nerves here, like gluteal nerves, so superior and inferior gluteal nerve. There's a pudendal nerve. And then the big one, the largest nerve of the body, so longest and thickest nerve of the body is your sciatic nerve. We've all heard of the sciatic nerve. It goes out that sciatic notch. It has its own notch in the hip. And then comes down through, and then it branches. But then within that, there's also the posterior femoral cutaneous nerve, not as important here. I do mention it in the lab. But then, okay, so now we split. This first split becomes the common fibular. So that's going to go down the fibula. Then that then breaks into the two different branches. One is the sural branch, which goes down the calf, and then there's also a superficial fibular and then a deep fibular. Again, it's hard to see on this model here, and that's why I show it in the lab portion. Just showing the sciatic nerve pretty much ends right here. Then it becomes the tibial, and then the tibial can all the way run down to the plantar branches as well. So just remember, sural is calf and so forth. But this part of the sciatic nerve, the longest and thickest nerve of the body. You might see that question again. Which is the largest and thickest nerve of the body? And then you know to answer sciatic nerve. Okay, so when spinal roots of the lumbar plexus are compressed, gait problems can occur. So sciatica is, I'll talk about on the next slide here, a lot of pain, but here, femoral nerve serves as prime movers that flex hip and extend knee. So damage to the femoral nerve can be caused by a herniated disc. So if you get a herniated disc up here pushing pressure on that femoral nerve, it's going to affect everything below it. Oops, I guess I can't erase that. There we go. If the obturator nerve is impaired, person experiences pain in the medial thigh. And then looking back here for sciatica, characterized by stabbing pain radiating over the course of the sciatic nerve. So look how many branches sciatic nerve has. So that's very, very painful. If the nerve is transected, leg is nearly useless and cannot be flexed because hamstrings are paralyzed. You can have foot drop from it because of the plantar branches of it down here. Recovery is usually slow and incomplete. And then if the tibial nerve is injured, paralyzed calf muscles cannot plantar flex foot and a shuffling gait develops. So sciatica, very painful. And then, like I was talking about, how the nerve that goes to the muscle also goes to the joint. So here, this is called Hilton's Law. Any nerve serving a muscle that produces a movement at a joint also innervates the joint and skin over that joint. It's monitoring it, monitoring the stretch, and so forth. And then because we didn't focus on them too much, there's also some specific body regions, such as going to the intercostal nerves of the thoracic cavity. Then also there are ones going to the back as well. So then the last part here, we're going to be looking at motor activity and how this all comes together to form motor output. So we began with sensory input, then we talked about all the different nerves, and now we get to send motor output. So now we have to release neurotransmitter. We talked about, we're not going to go over how muscle contracts again. That was ANP1. But remember, this takes place at the neuromuscular junction using acetylcholine. It goes there, you get the calcium release, you get a muscle contraction. And we had all the levels of motor control, which we talked about a lot of them in chapter 12. How everything is fine-tuned for that final motor output. It all depends on the sensory input. So when you pick up an aluminum can, you know kind of the pressure to put, and you not to squeeze it too much to crush that can if it's opened. And this is all these command centers working together. So let's start out here. So the pre-command, that's where you're initiating and sending the program. So this is dealing with the cerebellum and basal nuclei, modifying by sensory input. Projection level then goes to the motor cortex, that then conveys instructions to the spinal cord and sends that motor output out. But this pre-command level controls how powerful that signal is that's sent out. Then we go down to segmented level, which is in the spinal cord, and we have these things in there called CPGs. A CPG is a central pattern generator. So it generates a pattern that continues to fire for a reflex activity. So something like walking, you don't have to continuously tell yourself how to walk. You have the central pattern generator that allows you to just continue walking and using those muscles. So that's then all relates to motor output. So here, just going over a little bit in that segmental level. Again, it's the lowest one. This is all occurring within the spinal cord. So these central pattern generators are circuits that control locomotion and specific, often repeated motor activity. This consists of networks of oscillating inhibitory and excitatory neurons, which set crude rhythms and pattern of movements. And then projection level then goes to the upper motor neurons and the motor cortex. And so here, then we just talked about that. I won't go on this too much, but these send information to the lower motor neurons and keep higher command levels informed of what is happening. And then that pre-command level, again, is the one that uses the cerebellum and basal nuclei, which are regulating motor activity, monitoring muscle tone, coordinating movements, and also blocking unwanted movements. That's why something like Parkinson's disease, which is a disease of the basal nuclei, there's all the jerking movements involved with that. So the cerebellum acts on motor pathways to fine-tune it. The basal nuclei is then inhibiting those outputs. So then this all relates to reflex activity. And there's an inborn reflex and an acquired reflex. So inborn ones, or intrinsic, are rapid involuntary, predictable motor response to a stimulus. So maintaining posture, control visceral activities. You just slowly develop that through development, and you're going to have it. You learn how to regulate digestion and all that stuff just by living. You can be modified by learning and conscious effort, though. Then there are acquired reflexes. So think about your driving skills, riding a bike. You don't have to relearn how to ride a bike every time you ride a bike. So this is practice or repetition. It uses those central pattern generators so it continuously fire a reflex and work properly. The difference between learned reflexes and inborn reflexes. So we've seen this image before. So we have a receptor, but now we can talk about it in a little more detail on how it works. So we have a receptor. So a stimulus fires the signal, goes down this efferent division here. Here's the dorsal root ganglion. Now we know it goes into the dorsal horn, innervates through an interneuron. This is the integration center. Now this interneuron can go on the same side, or it can go through the gray commissure here and go to the other side and out. So we'll talk about that. Now we're going to be taking this one step further, but then we go out for an effector and a motor output. So I just wanted to remind everyone about the reflex arc, because we're going to talk about these in more detail now. So these are classified functionally as somatic reflexes. Those are activating skeletal muscle, or autonomic, which are visceral. And if you remember, visceral, if it's coming out of the autonomic, it comes out of the lateral horn. So this is the lateral horn here. Remember, this is the dorsal, and this is the ventral. So it's important to remember the different horns, because now we're focused on which one does what. So here, the spinal reflexes occur without direct involvement. So I use the hot pan analogy, or stepping on the Legos. Those are all spinal reflexes. And so you get these tested during development as well. Looks at condition of the nervous system. So if there's a problem, it may indicate degeneration or pathology of specific nervous system regions. Most commonly assessed reflexes are stretch, flexor, and superficial reflex. So the first ones here are the stretch and tendon reflexes. The book goes into lots of details on this, but just the take-home message is it's monitoring the stretch of your muscles and your tendons, making sure you don't get damage there. So length of muscle information is sent from muscle spindles. So this is the muscle spindle within the muscle, and then there's a tendon organ out here. So they work together. And then some of these are in the actual muscle spindle, but some of these are also in the muscle too. So there are these different muscle fibers here that communicate, constantly monitoring the stretch of this region. So this is just showing, so unstretched muscle fires fewer action potentials, a stretched muscle fires more action potentials, and that's what the information is sent to your body. You don't have to, we're not going to go into detail about the difference between the the alpha and gamma motor neurons. So, but you might see those words in your book. So it's just a difference between external and internal stretch, and they're both working together to monitor that. So if only the alpha motor neurons were activated, only the external muscles, so alpha ones are the inside here. So if alpha ones are activated, only the extrafusal muscle fibers contract, the muscle spindle becomes slack, no action potential. So here we don't see any. But normally you have this co-activation where everything works together. And that's pretty much just comes down to, think of these things working together, monitoring the stretch. And then here we have a stretch reflex. So one here is a knee jerk reflex, a stretch reflex that keeps knees from buckling when you stand upright. So when you're standing up, makes it so you don't fall down. So maintaining muscle tone in large posterior muscles and adjust it reflexively helps monitor your muscle tones at all times via these reflex arcs. So activates the muscle spindle. The sensory neurons then synapse directly with the alpha motor neurons, and then alpha motor neurons cause extrafusal muscles of stretch muscle to contract. Keeps everything tight, keeps that tone. And then we have the flexor withdrawal reflex. So think about withdrawing from something. So hot pan, Legos. This can be ipsilateral and polysynaptic. So what does that mean? Ipsilateral means it can go to the other side of the body. Polysynaptic means it can go through multiple different synapses and the interneurons and go to many different muscles. Because when you release your arm from something, you're both activating the muscle and you're extending one muscle and you're inhibiting another muscle or extending it. So you have a lot of action going on at one point. So here is protective and important for survival. Brain can override this. So knowing a finger stick for a blood test is coming, You don't pull away when that happens because your brain is like, oh, I know I'm about to get pricked. So you're ready for it. Whereas if you had your eyes closed, you would reflex away from it. So your brain can override this to a certain extent. So just going through a couple different examples here. So here you get quadriceps strongly contracts, tendon organs are activated. So here sending the input up. Let's say you get the knee jerk reflex here. So it goes through multiple synapses here. One is excitatory, one is inhibitory. So here causing extension of the quadriceps and flexing of the hamstring. So here the positive for excitatory, the negative for inhibitory. So inhibiting the quads and exciting the flexors, and then you have a simple tendon reflex there. And then you can take this ipsilaterally or a crossed extensor reflex. So this is like stepping on broken glass or Legos. You not only pick one leg up, you also add more force onto the other one. So this is the best way to look at this here is if someone grabs your arm. Let's say someone grabs your arm right here. This is the initial stimulus. What do you do when someone grabs your arm? You pull the arm that was grabbed away, then you try to push that person away with the other. So you have this immediate reflex where you go like that. So this has multiple innervations. So it's polysynaptic and ipsilateral, meaning it goes across the gray commissure here. So here, one of these is negative, one of these is excitatory, then over here, inhibitory, excitatory. So depending on whether you're pushing with one arm or pulling with the other. So ipsilateral cross extensor reflexes. And then some other ones here are superficial reflexes. So gentle cutaneous stimulation of an area. The two known clinical ones that we're going to talk about are the plantar reflex and the abdominal reflex. First one is the plantar reflex here. This tests for integrity of the cord from L4 to S2. So it's actually looking at spinal cord. So here, if you take just a little thing and rub it down the plantar of the foot, you want to see the toes point down. That's a normal plantar response. If the toes fan out, that is a response is a Babinski sign. So damage to motor cortex or corticospinal tracts causes that abnormal response. So normal in infancy to age of 1 year because myelination is still incomplete. So that's a way to look at those myelination levels and developmental levels as you're growing. Then another one here is the abdominal reflex. This is testing from T8 to T12. So doing light touches in the abdominal region. And so stroking the skin lateral to the dominant, above, below, or to the side of the umbilicus. And contraction of abdominal muscles, movement of umbilicus toward the stimulus. So it would move toward the stimulus depending on where it is. Vary intensity from one person to another, absent when corticospinal tract lesions are present. Again, a good diagnostic tool. And then to finish up here, to look at some of the developmental aspects. And we talked about this with the previous chapters, but just a little reminder here. So the spinal nerves form from the developing spinal cord and the neural crest cells. They exit between the forming vertebrae in those foramen, and then they just go out and search. They're like ones going for motor output are looking for neuromuscular junctions. So distribution and growth of spinal nerves correlate with segmented body plan as well. With age, sensory receptors do atrophy though, muscle tone decreases in face and neck, and reflexes do slow, and that's just because of wear and tear. Peripheral nerves are viable throughout life unless subjected to trauma though. But all right, that's all I have for this chapter here. If you have questions, feel free to reach out, email, or just messaging, or just you can also comment on the YouTube video. I might see it there as well. But besides that, I hope you all have a great day, and bye-bye.